Welcome, dear students, to the massive open online course on Political Economy 2. In today's discussion, we are going to focus on issues related to capitalism and socialism. This module would focus on the following. We would like to introduce the concept of property. We would explore the orthodox Marxist version of socialism, which we basically call the socialism Russian style, and we would also explain its effects on the process of production and the social moral structure. We would delve into the socio-economic consequences of a policy of socialization, basically the terms of impoverishment, and we would also explore the social democratic socialism. Now, what is property? Property is the most basic category in social sciences. Because for a concept of property to arise, there must be the concept of scarcity of goods. Should there be no scarcity, should all goods be so-called free goods, whose use by any one person for any one purpose would not in any way exclude or interfere or restrict its use by any other person or any other purpose, then there would have been no need for the use of the term property. As a matter of fact, all the other concepts that we are going to deal with in this module, like aggression, contract, socialism, capitalism, they are all definable in terms of the notion of property. Like aggression, we can call it aggression against property. Contract, we can call it a non-aggression relationship between the property owners. Socialism basically is an institutionalized policy of aggression against property. And capitalism also is an institutionalized policy of the recognition of property and contractualism. Now we know that apart from our body, all scarce resources are indeed unowned. This is the case as long as they remain in their natural state, unused by anyone. They can only become someone else's property once they are treated as scarce means, that is, as soon as they are occupied in some objective borders and put to some specific use by someone. And this act of acquiring previously unowned resources is called original appropriation. So once these unowned resources are appropriated, it becomes an aggression to uninvitedly change their physical characteristics or to restrict the owner's range of uses to which he can put these resources, as long as a particular use does not affect the physical characteristic of anyone else's property. Only in the course of a contractual relationship, that is when the natural owner of a scarce means explicitly agrees, is it possible for someone else to utilize and change the previously acquired things. And only if the original or the previous owner deliberately transfers his property title to someone else, either in exchange for something or, as a free gift, can this other person also himself become the owner of such things. So, all other resources can basically be alienated and a property title for them can be relinquished once and for all. And a social system which is based on this natural position regarding the assignment of property right is what we know as, or what can be called as, a pure capitalist. And since its ideas can also be discerned as the dominating ideas of private law, that is, as the norms regulating relations between the private persons, it might also be termed as a pure private law system. And this system is based on the idea that to be non-aggressive, claims to property must be backed by the objective fact of an act of original appropriation, of private ownership, or by a mutually beneficially contractual relationship. And this relationship can be a deliberate cooperation between the property owners or the deliberate transfer of property titles from the owner to another. And if this system is altered, and instead a policy is instituted that assigns rights of exclusive control over the scarce means, though it can be partial also, to persons or groups of persons that can point neither to an act of previous usership of the things concerned nor to a contractual relation with some previous user owner, then this notion will be called as partial socialism. As I have already said before, that socialism can be defined by the institutionalized policy of redistribution of property titles. So it is nothing but a transfer of property titles from people who have actually put scarce means to some use or who have acquired them contractually from people who have done so previously onto persons who have neither done anything with the things in question nor have they acquired them contractually. So it's mere redistribution of titles, of property ownership. Socialism par excellence is a social system in which the means of production, that is, the scarce resources used to produce the consumption goods, are quote unquote nationalized or quote unquote socialized. We generally consider that a superior alternative is something which is called socialism. So socialization of the means of production, at least of those of big industry and big business, has been advocated by all socialists of orthodox Marxian persuasion ever since. Almost complete socialization of the means of production. This has been tried out mainly in Soviet Union and later in all the Soviet-dominated countries of Eastern Europe, as well as in many other number of other countries all over the world. If we try to understand the forces, the motivational forces which are pushing the socialization schemes, we can clearly say that, of course, they are egalitarian in character. There is no discrimination, very much egalitarian in character. But once you allow private property in the means of production, you are basically allowing differences to step in. Let's take an example to understand this. If I own resource A and there is somebody who does not own it, suppose you don't own resource A, then what will be the relationship between my owning of resource A and your owning of resource A? Of course, our relationship with that resource would obviously be different. Hence, by abolishing private ownership, everyone's position vis-a-vis the means of production is equalized with one stroke. That is, it becomes egalitarian. Everyone becomes co-owner of everything, reflecting everyone's equal standing as human beings. There is no differentiation. And the economic rationale of such a scheme is that it is supposedly considered to be more efficient. Now, to an observer who is untrained, unfamiliar with the action coordinating function of how prices operate in an economy, capitalism as based on private ownership of means of production, it might really appear chaotic. Because since they do not really understand how prices tend to equate themselves between supply and demand, and how prices tend to equate when there is private ownership of means of production, it really looks very much chaotic in nature. And it also seems that it is a wasteful system which is characterized by duplicating efforts, ruins competition, and absence of concerted and coordinated actions. Marxists have usually called it depreciatively they call it capitalism as an anarchy of production. Only when we tend to substitute collective ownership in the place of private ownership, then the Marxist feels that it becomes possible to eliminate this waste by implementing a single, comprehensive, coordinated production plan. We would now discuss the socio-economic consequences of the policy of socialization. There is generally a relative drop in the rate of investment and the rate of capital formation. Since socialization favors the non-user, the non-producer, the non-contractor of a means of production, and generally raises the cost for users, for producers, for contractors, there will be fewer people who would like to act in the role of the latter. There will be less original appropriation of natural resources whose scarcity has been realized, and there will be less production of new and less upkeep of old factors of production, and there will also be less amount of contracting. For all these activities involve cost, and costs of performing them have been raised, and there are alternative also courses of action that are available, such as leisure consumption activities, which at the time have become relatively less costly, and thus they are more open and available to the agents or actors. Along the same line, because everyone's investment outlets have dried up, as it is no longer permissible to convert private savings into private investment, or because the outlets have been limited to the extent to which the economy is socialized, there will therefore be less savings and more consumption, less work and more leisure in the context of socialization. After all, you cannot be a capitalist any longer, or your possibility of becoming one has been restricted, and so there is at least one reason less to save. Needless to say, the result of these will be a reduced output of exchangeable goods and a lowering of living standards in terms of such goods. And since these lowered living standards have been forced upon the people, and the consumers have not made this lowering of their living standards as their natural choice or their deliberate choice, so they deliberately change their relative evaluation of leisure and exchangeable good as a result of work. That is, since it is experienced as an unwanted impoverishment, a tendency will evolve to compensate for such losses. They did not want to make this loss. It was not their conscious decision. So they would try to compensate for these type of losses by going underground, by moonlighting, or by creating black markets. Secondly, this was the first policy which leads to impoverishment, and that was not a conscious impoverishment. Secondly, the policy of socialization of means of production will result in a wasteful use of such means. That is, in use which at best satisfies our second-rate needs and at worst satisfies no needs at all but exclusively increases the cost. The reason for this is the existence and unavoidability of change. Once it is admitted that there can be change in consumer demand, change in technological know-how, change in natural environment in which the process of production has to take place, and all of this indeed takes place constantly and unceasingly, then it must also be admitted that there is a constant and never-ending need to recognize, to reorganize, and reshuffle the whole structure of social production. There is always a need to withdraw old investment from some lines of production and together with new ones pour them into other lines, thus making certain productive establishments, certain branches, or even certain sectors of the economy to shrink and other sectors to expand. Now assume that, and this is precisely what is done under the process of socialization, that it is either completely illegal or extremely difficult to sell the collectively owned means of production into private hands. And there is no market price for the means of production to exist, or the formation of such prices is hindered and made more costly. So it hardly needs to be pointed out that this too contributes to the process of impoverishment that the socialization process entails. Thirdly, socializing the means of production causes relative impoverishment. That is, a drop in the general standard of living by leading to an overutilization of the given factors of production. The reason for this again lies in the peculiar position of a caretaker as compared to that of a private owner in the context of capitalism. A private owner, basically a capitalist, has a right to sell the factors of production and keep the money receipts privately. Because of this, he will try to avoid any increase in production which occurs at the expense of the value of the capital employed. His objective is to maximize the value of the products produced plus that of the resources that have been used to produce those products, because he owns both of them. Thus, he will stop production when the value of the marginal product produced is lower than the depreciation of the capital that have been used to produce it. Accordingly, he will reduce the depreciation costs involved in producing, and instead he will engage in increased conservatism. If he anticipates a future rise in the price for the products produced and vice versa. Vis-a-vis, let's look at the situation of the caretaker in a socialized pattern of system. That is, the incentive structure which the caretaker is facing is quite different from that of a private owner of capital. Because he cannot sell the means of production, his incentive is to not produce and thereby utilize the capital that is employed at the expense of an excessive reduction in capital value. If not completely gone, then at least relatively reduced. Since the caretaker in a socialized economy cannot privately appropriate the receipts from the sale of the products, but must hand them over to the community of caretakers at large to be used at their discretion, his incentive to produce and sell products at all is relatively weakened. It is precisely this fact that explains the lower rate of capital formation in a socialistic pattern of economy. But as long as the caretaker works and produces at all, his interest in gaining an income evidently exists, even if it cannot be used for purpose of private capital formation, but only for private consumption. So he is not trying to accumulate capital. It is not possible for him to accumulate capital, but he would rather use it for private consumption and or the creation of private, non-productively used wealth. The caretaker's inability to sell the means of production implies that the incentive to increase his private income at the expense of the capital value is raised. Accordingly, to the extent that he sees his income dependent on the output of the products produced, the salary that is paid to him by the community of caretakers might be dependent on this. His incentive will be raised to increase his output at the expense of capital. And furthermore, since the actual caretaker as he is not identical with the community of caretakers, can never be completely and permanently supervised, and he can derive his income by using the means of production for private purposes. Okay? He will be encouraged to increase this output at the expense of the capital value to the extent that he sees his income dependent on such private production. So please keep in mind one thing, that in this context, the capitalist or the capitalist who owns the private factors of production, he is able to extract or he is able to accumulate capital, but the socialist can increase his personal consumption but is not in a position to accumulate capital. So in any case, capital consumption and overuse of existing capital will occur, and increased capital consumption once more implies relative impoverishment, since the production of future exchange goods will as a consequence be reduced. So the theoretically foreseen consequences of relative impoverishment proved to be so powerful that in fact a policy of socializing the means of production could never actually be carried through to its logical end. So indeed, sooner or later, all actual realization of Marxist socialism have had to reintroduce elements of private ownership in the means of production in order to overcome or prevent manifestation of bankruptcy. The disappointing experience with the Russian-type socialism, which had led to a constant decline in the popularity of the orthodox Marxist socialism, has spurred the emergence and development of modern democratic socialism, which is a concern. Both type of socialism, the similarities between them, they derive from the same ideological sources. Both are egalitarian in motivation, at least in theory, and both essentially have the same ultimate goal. The central features of socialism in the social democratic style, they does not outlaw private ownership in the means of production, and they even accept the idea of all means of production being privately owned, just like capitalist, with the exception only of education, traffic, communication, central banking, police, and courts. In principle, everyone has the right to privately appropriate and own means of production, to sell, buy, or newly produce them, to give them away as a present, or to rent them out to someone else under a contractual arrangement. No owner of the means of production rightfully owns all of the income that can be derived from the usage of his means of production, and no owner is left to decide how much of the total income from production to allocate to consumption and investment. The difference between these two types of socialism lies as follows. Under the Russian type socialism, society's control over the means of production and hence over the income produced with them is complete. And so there seems to be no more room to engage in any sort of political debate about the proper degree of politicization of society. The issue is settled. Just as it is settled at the other end of the spectrum under pure capitalism, where there is no room for politics at all and all relations are exclusively contractual. Under social democratic socialism, on the other hand, social control over income produced privately is actually only partial, and increased or full control exists only as society's not yet actualized right, making only for a potential threat hanging over the hands of private producers. So we would like to conclude this module here, as we can say that there is no economic justification for socialism. Socialism did promise to bring more economic prosperity to the people than capitalism, and much of its popularity was based on this promise. But the arguments that we had been discussing here have proved that basically the opposite is true. We have looked into the various options of impoverishment that socialization generally entails. It has been shown that in the Russian-type socialism, which is characterized by nationalized or socialized means of production, it involves economic waste, since no price for factors of production would exist, and hence no cost accounting could be accomplished. And as regards social democratic socialism, it has been demonstrated that in any event, a rise in the cost of production and a decline in the cost of its alternatives take place, that is a non-production or black market production, and so would lead to a relative reduction in the production of wealth. And so we see that in both the versions of socialism, there is an incentive structure compared to a capitalist system that relatively favors non-producers, favors non-contractors over producers and contractors of goods, products, and services.